I feel the presence of the Lord. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. I love real. I hate fake. This is real. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. Pastor Jerry, you and Sister Christina are doing a phenomenal job. I love diversity because I believe that is the kingdom of God in heaven and on earth. Somebody shout hallelujah. I'd like to do a couple of songs I haven't done for a long time. And so the Lord will bring all things to our remembrance. Should I forget a word or two? Most of y'all aren't going to know it anyway. Hallelujah. Won't you turn to somebody and say, this is your time. There is a voice that's calling out to every nation under heaven and universe. The time has come to worship Him and let the praises of thy God shake the earth. This is our time. Come on, let's sing. Let us worship and adore our risen King. Come on, let's dance. Let us be free. Let us come before your throne in victory. This is our time. Can I get a witness today? There is a voice calling out to every nation under heaven and universe. The time has come to worship Him and let the praises of thy God shake the earth. This is our time. Come on, let's sing. Let us worship and adore our risen King. Come on, let's dance. Let us be free. Let us come before your throne in victory. This is our time. Lord, we need the power of love. So we will see you shine. This is our time. Come on, let's sing. Let us worship and adore Cohen today. I'm so excited. This song is by special request. Would you bring that little lady up here just a second? This church is filled with many little ladies just like this little lady. Come up here just a second. Hallelujah. Jesus said, forbid not the little children. This is one of God's little children. And like I said, we got many of God's little children out there today. So what's your name? Did you get that? Yes. God's got something incredible in store for your life. She mentioned this song last night, so it's about special request from me to you. I appreciate all the young men in this church. And young ladies. I feel some holy rain up in here today.
address yesterday that I didn't get to before we proceed with looking at other things. So I told you I would address how sea life died in the oceans in connection with Noah's flood, basically the equivalent of the sea-going dinosaurs. So one of the things that has been addressed by others, by creationists, is the chemical changes that would have occurred in the ocean waters. Basically acidification from the cometary and asteroid bombardment and that water coming up from beneath the surface of the Earth, that continental crust that was shattered when the impacts occurred. So in essence what they're saying, and I haven't done this basic research, this is based on other people's science, is that the acidification of the ocean would have killed a lot of those creatures early on. And so that's all I can really tell you about that, but I said I would mention it. You can look this up. I'm trying to remember his name. If I think of it, I'll tell you the name of the scientist, or I'm trying to remember, a creationist who came up with a flood model that addresses this. The other thing you can look at is programs that deal with impacts where the dinosaurs supposedly died out 65 million years ago, roughly. Some of those will address the changes to the chemical composition of the oceans that would have killed a lot of that life very rapidly, even though they've got their time frames wrong and they leave the flood out of it. So they got a lot wrong, but that part they got right. So I'll just refer you to those for the moment, and if I remember who that creationist is, I'll tell you later. I should be remembering, but I'm drawing a blank. So it's going to tell you also today how the catastrophe happened. I mean, I talked about the fact that Earth was struck and that we can see some outlines of craters. So there's some residual evidence, trace fossils if you want to call it that, of humongous craters on Earth that could have wiped out the dinosaurs and most of the life on the planet when the impacts occurred and crushed that supercontinental shelf. All of that happened very recently. So the flood was roughly a little less than 43 centuries ago. That's when it occurred, biblically. And all of that was recent. So what I didn't tell you is how the comets and asteroids came to be in the first place. And we're going to touch on that more today. Modern macroevolutionary, meaning evolution in the sense that you normally think of it, where creatures evolve from nothing into creatures or suddenly change species, not species, but suddenly change types of creatures, evolving from one creature to another. That's not scientific, it's not biblical, it's not even the equivalent, in my view, of magic. So there's nothing to it scientifically that's true. But macroevolutionists are the ones who are running the show, for the most part, in modern astrophysics, in universities that address astrophysics, in astrobiology, in exobiology, in cosmogony, which is basically the question of how did the universe come to be, how did life come to be. Cosmology is more of an equivalent word for astrophysics. But anyway, the macroevolutionists are running that show. And what they have said is that the solar system formed from gases. In other words, that gases were the initial matter after the so-called Big Bang, slowly coalescing into tiny, tiny grains of dust, and then eventually little bigger grains of dust, and then little clumps of what we might call dirt, and building on up till you get to something like little rocks, and then finally small comets, small asteroids, building up to the bigger bodies, and eventually those things all just collided enough and stuck together enough with the minor gravity they would have to form small moons, and then or planetary bodies, and then eventually on up to planets. And of course that's what they say. If that were true, the only thing you could find in comets and asteroids would be basic chemicals. You would find ice, mud, rock, dirt, basically nothing else other than some basic chemicals. You might find some organic chemicals, primitive ones, not complex organics generally. And if you got very lucky, like impossibly lucky, you might find some bacterium, or you happened to land, and it happened to land, but floated through space for who knows how long after it got blasted off the Earth after the Earth was impacted 65 million years ago, roughly, according to the macroevolutionists, right? So that's the claim, and that would be for them an evidence of quote-unquote panspermia, the idea that life reached a comet or asteroid from Earth, and maybe the opposite could happen from a comet or asteroid. It could reach a planetary body and take root, and voila, you get evolution on a new body for bacterium, and someday you get people like us. But they look weird. So, you know, that's what they say. And it's their hope to find bacteria on a comet or asteroid someday. Bacterium, or bacteria, whatever. That's the most that they hope for, and the odds against that are, like I said, nearly impossible. Space is very big. Even though there are a lot of comets and asteroids out there, they're not very common, actually, to come across. If you were traveling through space, you'd be lucky to come across one, unless you happen to intentionally go to one. And the idea that something could float over that distance and land on something like that that's moving around the sun, and then we might land in exactly that spot and detect it, is, you know, I think it's good fiction, right? Okay. But the problem is, that's not what comets and asteroids are. And I'm proving that in this Solar Apocalypse series of books. One of the volumes is dedicated, to comets and asteroids and what's actually in them. In fact, they're filled with complex biological life and fossils. Most of the life, maybe all of it, is dead, but there was movement, clearly, in the photos that I have, on those bodies before creatures froze in place. And it's just possible that on some of the larger ones, because they are so cavernous and could have frozen water ice within them, and that would melt periodically for many of them as they're, you know, approaching the sun. So it could, you know, periodically melt and free things up, that there could be some ongoing life in some of those bodies. It's actually not impossible. And you're going to understand that when I show you what's on our moon. You know, when I start to talk about that today also. So if you can imagine the possibility of life on our moon, well, then it's really a no-brainer that it could also happen on comets and asteroids. So we'll get to that. But the point I want to make at this moment, before I dive into other things, is that if you can show that there are fossils, big ones even, and sometimes skeletons, sitting there exposed on the surface of comets and asteroids, all of them, every one of them that we have visited literally and photographed up close has this. If you can show that, it totally destroys the models of astrophysics, macroevolutionary astrophysics, for the formation of our solar system. It annihilates it. They literally have no means then to explain the existence of a solar system like ours. It overturns macroevolutionary astrophysics in this area in cosmogony, because now their explanation for origins isn't possible.
Right.
In terms of the solar system, talking about physical planetary bodies, not even life in that instance. They no longer have a viable model in their minds over any period of time for the formation of the solar system. And of course, Scripture tells us that God spoke the universe into existence from nothing. He created it from nothing. You know, we read that in Genesis 1. The word bara is used for created, and it means from nothing in Hebrew. And we know also from that account in Genesis, the sun and the moon were provided as lights to the earth on the fourth day. So for 3 days, the earth was sitting here alone in the solar system, basically. Maybe in the universe, for all we know, but certainly in the solar system. And then God added the sun, you know, and I presume at that point put the earth moving around it, and added a moon to orbit the earth, to give light to the earth. Now Israel's sages, rabbis, whatever you prefer to call them, I don't like the term rabbi because of what the Lord said in Scripture. You know, call no man rabbi, right? Or teacher or master or these kinds of things. In other words, God is our master, He's our teacher, and He is the ultimate rabbi. Yeshua is, right? So we don't want to call humans that in a highly spiritual or religious sense, because that's God's role.
That's right.
All of those are God's roles.
Amen.
But where I'm going with that is Israel's ancient sages said that the light that the earth received for the first 3 days was from the Messiah, the pre-incarnate Messiah, that God Himself gave light to the world during that period of time. just like his son. S-U-N. All right. So our solar system, the catastrophe that happened, comets and asteroids, where do they really come from if they're populated with complex biological life and fossils? So I'm going to come back to that. Just bear that in your mind. I told you there were other things I'd show you concerning Mars before we dive into all of that also. And I wanted to talk about paganism and transhumanism a little bit. So one of the things that I talked about in relation to the fall of mankind is that Satan sought to tempt Eve with the notion that she could actually have the very wisdom of God himself, not become wise, but have God's wisdom, and that she could be like God himself. You know, and I shared yesterday in our first presentation that Adam and Eve may very well have shone with God's Shekinah glory before they fell, because something changed from the instant before they fell and after to where they then realized they were naked. There was some change to their physical appearance, I presume, not just a spiritual realization. So, and of course, Adam walked with God in the garden. How would he not have been, you know, covered in God's glory from that, just like Moses, you know, when Moses was with the Lord on Mount Sinai and came down and his face shone so that Israel was fearful of him, and he had to put a veil over his head to cover that till it dissipated. Amen. So what Satan was suggesting he could enable Eve to have if she would disobey God and distrust God and trust him, Satan, instead, God has offered us through Christ, through Yeshua, in his death, burial, and resurrection, by saying to us, if we believe one day at the point that we die, or if he returns and we're still alive, he will resurrect us or translate us in an instant to have eternal bodies like his. And Yeshua told us our faces would shine like the sun in his kingdom. Amen. Now here's my point. There's no imagined version of transhumanism that exists that could come close to that. And when we talk about paganism in the past, where, and this gets into humanoids, when I was talking about humanoids yesterday, yes. You know, they would worship these humanoids, Nephilim originally, and then later humanoids, as quote-unquote gods. And you find glyphs and pictures that they've drawn, sometimes of what look like saucers, sometimes of what look like gray aliens, quote-unquote aliens. And I've shared with you, I don't believe that there are real aliens. And I would need to define what the word alien means, so you understand that. And I'll come back to that. But I'm going to use the word alien. It's not, in my view, what the world thinks it is. So, in this case, when we talk about humanoids, there's indication that they interacted with past primitive mankind. So not just secretly today, with governments in secret space programs and doing their nefarious activities for abductions and reproduction through abduction, as I shared yesterday, but in the past. And one of the things that pagans did was they would try to emulate the appearance of their quote-unquote gods. And Ancient Aliens recently had a show where they were showing this. They were actually going in this direction, and that's a very wicked television series that has some good information and a lot of intentional misinformation. It's not always that they're just wrong. Oftentimes they're intentionally misleading the audience for sensational purposes, to build their audience, to make crazy claims, and then to expound on those. Among these shows, very recently, this current season, season 14, they were showing how pagans would stretch their neck, you know, wrap their heads in boards to give a conical shape to the skull, put boards in their lips to extend their lips, you know, things on their ears to make their ears really big, do other weird things with their bodies, and in some cases so that they can try to emulate the appearance of their quote-unquote gods. So this was the ancient pagan version in some cases of trying to be like their fake gods, their quote-unquote alien gods. The modern version of that is transhumanism. Now we have technology today, and Ancient Aliens was again in the same episode trying to point out, okay, now we're trying to be like our alien creators, our alien gods. You know, they're not our creators, they're not our gods, they're fakes from start to finish. And just because they have genes in common with us doesn't mean we came from them. In fact, the opposite is the case, which is the reason they abduct humans in order to take biological materials so that they can, in laboratory situations with their own quote-unquote recipes, genetic recipes, reproduce themselves. That's how they do it. At any rate, with transhumanism, they're trying to talk about the notion of eventually becoming technologically advanced enough to where we can transfer a human mind into a machine, an advanced kind of a computer, and then into an artificial technological body, and keep doing that to achieve a kind of corporeal immortality.
Right.
And of course, if that could be achieved, there wouldn't be a soul there anymore. Not the kind that God made, right?
Right.
And you'd be looking at a very strange form of artificial intelligence. And technologically, it may be possible someday to do that. And they're crazy enough to try to get there. And when we look at just where we are today, versus even 3 decades ago, I mean, the stuff that we have today was unimaginable, 30, 40 years ago. So we're rapidly advancing in that direction, and they're actively looking to try to do this. Another thing they do that's closer to what ancient pagans did is body augmentation, with technology in this case. In this same Ancient Aliens episode, they showed a fellow with horns, the stubs for horns on his head, so that he would emulate looking like the devil.
Exactly.
And biochip implants, in other parts of the body so that you could remotely do things that right now we need some other thing like a card scan or whatever. And they were upholding this as a noble thing, as if this fellow who was doing these things, as one example they brought up, was ahead of the curve. And this was the future for humanity, where we would augment our bodies and try to get to this point of being like the quote-unquote alien gods who have been messing with their bodies this whole time. And that's why they can't reproduce on their own anymore, right? But that's not really why they can't. It's because God put genetic barriers there to prevent it. In some cases, they've succeeded, it seems, in overcoming the barriers. I showed you examples, like this one that you're seeing here, of complex biological life on Mars, both fossils and living. And I told you I'd show you one today that moved massively. I'm going to get to that soon. So it's not all dead on Mars, but the fact that it's there at all suggests, living in other words, and apparently recently dead or fossilized in some cases perhaps, suggests that they must have somehow overcome the barrier of reproduction, at least for some of these hybrids. Some of these creatures are managing to reproduce on their own, but they don't seem to have done it with humans or humanoids yet because they keep abducting us. There are continual stories of this all the time, and they're coming out, and like I said yesterday, often even in clinical settings, under hypnosis, with testimonies that agree between people who never met each other in terms of their experiences, what was done to them, what they encountered, what was said to them, for example, like being brainwashed into environmental agendas, because these creatures don't want us to blow ourselves up, to annihilate life on Earth. Not yet, because they still need us. Okay? So we'll come to this. I'm going to show you a moving creature on Mars. You still hear me okay? Yes. Okay. Thank you. But anyway, the point was, paganism and transhumanism are an attempt to do it our way, if you want to put it in that light, and to be like the quote-unquote alien gods, for past pagan humans, and for modern pagan humans. Transhumanists are pagans. They are rejectors of God. They don't believe in His promises. They are trying to get there technologically. And in the process, they're mutilating their bodies, just like ancient pagans. It's crazy, some of the stuff you can see that they've done to their bodies, like the horns. Okay? It's shocking, in fact. So if you want to watch that episode for no other reason than to get a good idea of how Ancient Aliens is intentionally deluding the public and promoting things that are outright satanic as desirable. When Eve thought the serpent was desirable, they are lost in this deluded mindset. It's very steep.
Yes.
Okay. Fossilization. I want to come back to this too. When I talked to you about types of fossilization yesterday, I only basically addressed 2 kinds. Well, yeah, 2 kinds. One is to bones, right, which is the common thing we see in our museums, right? We're all pretty accustomed to that. That's what we usually see in the news, etc. I showed you a flash fossilized nodosaur that was quite impressive like this, only it had to be chiseled out of rock for 7 years. And this thing's just sitting here on the surface fully exposed almost on Mars, right? Meaning the burial that happened on Earth didn't happen as much on Mars, for example. So the cataclysm there was a bit different, and its oceans and so forth, a lot of it was blown into space. We're going to come back to that, and how Mars has struck the whole cataclysm. I'm going to get into some more detail on it. But on fossilization, there's actually more than just fossilization, mineralization of bones, you know, after the exterior body of a creature has been eaten away by bacteria, or the rapid flash fossilization of a creature when it's, you know, submersed in water and bacteria rapidly gets into the tissues and the proper chemicals are there so the thing can fossilize literally in hours to days from start to finish and end up like that, or like that nodosaur that we saw. There are other kinds of fossilization, and those occur on the moon, our moon, have occurred. In some cases on Mars, but mostly colder areas. And then, of course, on comets and asteroids. When I get into how they were produced, I'm going to talk about freeze-dried fossilization, okay? And where something becomes frozen but then desiccates so that if you touch it, it turns to powder. But before that, you see the exterior appearance. So in some cases, these things are frozen hard. You know, you're not going to hurt them if you stomp on them. And in others, if you touch them, you get powder. They're just gone because they're so desiccated. And when insects, and it gets back also to the type of life that fossilized. So when we talk about insects, for example, on Earth, when they die and they dry out, you touch them, eventually they get dry enough and they basically crush and can turn to powder when they get dry enough. That's what happens. So it gets back to the kind of life. Is it exoskeletal, endoskeletal? Was it tissue like this? Or was it something where it could get desiccated to the point where it would crush easily once it was totally dried out? So we don't talk about that on Earth because we don't see it here. But we do see it on the moon. We do see it on comets and asteroids. So I'm going to come back to that. But particularly on the moon. So, all right, what else do I want to address? Oh yes, I mentioned algae as complex biology a couple of times yesterday, and I actually meant to say the word lichen. Lichen is a combination of algae and fungus and sometimes bacteria. Algae can be complex biology, particularly when you're talking about seaweed, you know, the more complex versions of algae. But usually it's considered fairly simple, a little bit above bacteria, but not on the level of algae. And so I misspoke when I said that. I just want to correct myself. But again, there's lots of lichen and lots of algae on Mars, and fungus also. In fact, I'd like to show it to you. I don't know if I'll get to it today. Maybe I'll do it as a special temporary thing tonight. But one fellow involved in astrobiology pointed out to NASA that there was this series of photos that the rover took, and in one initial photo there was no little blue purplish white thing, little blob. And then later there was, and it grew between photos. And so NASA looked at this thing trying to find a way to explain it away, because it was very obvious that it was actually fungal, similar to a mushroom, and colorful, and completely different from the surroundings. And then it grew from this little seed thing. I'll call it a seed thing because it wasn't really a seed, it was a little blob of fungus initially. But NASA missed that. At any rate, they tried to explain it away as, oh, there must have been a little, meteorite that struck nearby and popped this thing out of the ground. That's why it looks so different from the, the surface. It must have just gotten flipped over, landed like that, and we happened to catch the photo. And no, yeah, the rover wasn't hit. We're so thankful. Complete nonsense. And the thing is, that's just one example that was brought up. There are dozens and dozens of things exactly like it on the surface of Mars. The exact same kind of fungus that has appeared in multiple places and has grown in some cases between a series of photos. Nobody talked about that or caught that. I've got some examples, and hopefully I'll get to show those in the Solar Apocalypse series. I try to focus on the more spectacular things like this, because nobody can argue with this, right? Even if NASA wants to make something up for how that suddenly appeared and grew, in front of the rover, they can't do so with something like this. So I try to focus more on the absolutely undeniable, unambiguous things rather than just the okay, NASA, we know you're lying. That's weird. Maybe you'll get away with that with some folks. So let's just move on, right? Okay. And I do want to mention something else in relation to this. Did I talk about William or Moser yesterday to all of you? I know I did to Pastor Carter, but is that familiar to anybody? Okay. William Moser is a professor of entomology for 45 years now, a professor emeritus at Ohio State University, who wrote a college level textbook on entomology, and then did, I think, 3 revisions of that, so there were 4 editions. And so a well-known entomologist who's well-respected, etc. He came out this month, just a couple weeks ago, earlier this month, and presented at a conference of entomologists where he put together this little poster and he said, see, there are reptiles and arthropods on Mars. And he said, the classic definition of an arthropod is it's got 3 body segments, 6 legs, 3 on either side, and a pair of antennae. That was the definition he provided as a well-known, long-time professor entomologist. He didn't have this photo right here that you're looking at. And the photos that he showed, for the most part, he was trying, were very, very poor. And even I, who just sees things like that, on Mars, had great difficulty recognizing the things that he was saying were in some of his photos. Maybe a third of his photos were actually pretty decent, but didn't show the segmentation and the legs and so forth clearly that he was saying these creatures had. He also tried to say that there was a bee-like flying insect, a group of them on Mars, where he captured the shadow basically of one coming down off an embankment, pulling up and then landing. Again, I had a hard time seeing that, really. I had to stretch to see some of that. If he'd had this one photo, his case would have been made before the world. And he was showing little things compared to this. On this, you'll notice there are 3 body segments here, here, and then of course the head. And then 3 legs on each side. There's the other front leg right there, it's just partially exposed. But that right there is an arthropod on Mars. And it's got these appendages where the wings would go, this V shape right here. It's not a creature that flies, I presume it never could, but it's got the appendages for that, suggesting also that it's a hybrid, apart from other factors. And it's got this heart-like head. Let me see if I can go back to the other one here. Now my remote's not working again for switching slides. So one sec. Try to make it function one more time. Okay, pardon me, I'm going to come back to this here. So I want it to work. Let's restart this from the current slide. See if it works now. It's magic. Okay. There we go. So what I want you to see is notice the impressions for the 2 eyes right here. The nose area, you got the eyes, the nose area, the mouth. And this might be an antenna, I don't know. Right here, a little fraction of a remaining antenna, I have no idea. I'm guessing on that, I can't tell. But it's a heart-like shaped head, or, more or less, I guess. Anyway, he needed that photo, and I'm going to share it with him. I'm now communicating with him. Because he made news all over the world for no other reason than he's an entomologist with a PhD who's been around for a long time, well known in the field, and now he's claiming there's reptilian and insectoid life on Mars. Now somehow he thought he was the only one, because he said, as far as I know, I'm the only one to present a formal paper on this. And of course it wasn't really that formal because it hasn't been peer reviewed, which is fine, because in my view, people like us, me, him, we don't have any peers on this yet, quite honestly. There's no one to do the review. I could peer review his stuff, but there's very few others. There are very few others who could. So, on Mars anyway. So that being said, he needs this. I'm going to share that with him. He also showed a pretty interesting photo of a fossilized reptile on Mars. I thought it was pretty decent. Yeah, but the news, they just mocked him because the other photos were just so hard to see. You know, they were actually a little worse than the version of the Loctoid thing that I showed a year and a half ago here. And I told you yesterday I intentionally didn't show the better stuff because I'm concerned about this until I'm ready to go to press with it, you know, sharing the better stuff. At any rate, the point is the news media is hearing more about this now. But then he didn't know that there was someone like me or others who've been looking at this issue of life on Mars for more than a decade. There's a group called Mars Anomaly Research Society, with the acronym MARS. They've been around for a number of years now and put out all kinds of photos, not this quality. Once in a while they have a decent one. Usually it's more like what this professor was putting out. But people have been looking at the idea of life on Mars for several years, and not bacterial life, complex biological life, as well as fossils, artifacts, and so forth. Quite often people will look at these photos and they'll just make something up in their mind and they'll see things that aren't there. So in many cases they're not just putting out poor photos, they're putting out explanations that are actually nonsense. Once in a while they put out a proper explanation and a pretty decent photo. But there are, I don't know, maybe tens of thousands of people associated with us who are working on it and contributing to the Mars Facebook page. I'm a member of that group. I know the people who run it and who started it. But anyway, I will be sharing some things with them after I go public, because while the world hasn't been convinced by the photos they've been sharing, they'll have to be by these. All right, so Professor Moser, he's a macroevolutionist. I hope to win him for the Lord. Please pray for him in that regard. He doesn't understand how these things got on Mars, so he has put out some pretty decent speculations. And he doesn't understand that they died recently, at least not in his formal presentation. But I've shared some of these things with him over messaging. And he's very excited to see this stuff. He hasn't seen any of this yet. Okay. All right, so let's move on. I promised to show you an example of that creature I showed you, which had a shell-like back that was upright and a couple more fossilized heads, or just heads looking out from its shoulder area, that it was moving on Mars between photos. So here we go. So let me point out what's not here and what is here in this photo, and I'm going to show you, I think, about 7 or 8 photos. So don't get too confused by what you're seeing just yet. So if you look right here, that's the tail I was sharing with some of you. It looks like a devil's tail, like you see the little red devil with a tail that sticks out and that little, I don't know, diamond on the end. This thing has a tail right here. And you see that crack right there? I thought because of that crack this had to be a fossil. But in other images here, the crack goes away somehow in this series. I don't know if that's because of the camera or what, but what I want you to see is what is here and what isn't. That's what I want you to pay attention to. In this photo, before we move on, there are actually a lot of fossils here. And I think it's hard for you to see probably in this lighting, but we'll try. So just notice very carefully what's here and what's not, just to make a picture in your mind. This is an interesting fossilized head right here. It's actually pretty good. It's like a sea creature. And that's the eye right there, right at the pointer. And the nose and mouth area right there. It's a disembodied head, I think, but it's a pretty good fossil. There are others in here. There are actually quite a few in the foreground. And the rover is probably about 3 or 4 times the distance of what you can see right there from that object in the background right there. But look at what's right there, and let's move on. I'm going to go back and forth here so you can catch this stuff. Okay, another image in the series, and they took left and right images of this. They captured it basically in stereo, if you want to look at it in stereo. I'm going to show you both the left and right images and each, so we'll have a total of, I think, about 8 images. So again, notice what's here and what isn't. Take a close look. Look at the background carefully. Again, the tail. Look at this carefully right here, and then notice what's not here and what is there, okay? Moving on. This is the other side, the other, left-right pair. I don't know which is left or right now, but anyway, again, notice what's there. So this is one dual image taken at the same time between left and right cameras. Okay, and then there's this again, which is, I don't know where the other half is for this, but again, notice what's there and what's not. Everybody got sort of a picture in your mind? Anybody see any differences yet? Because something has changed. Okay. Okay, notice right here. Here to here. Anybody see any differences?
Yes.
Yeah, not just the tail moved, but that's possibly just and probably just a shift in the angle of the camera from the rover. It's probably not actual movement on the tail. Although that being said, with that change in angle or whatever happened, you no longer see that crack so much right there, do you? Okay? But notice this right here. That's what I want you to focus on right there. Okay? Look at this little spot right here. Go back. See a change?
Is the extra one?
Okay, so we got 3 photos here. See something just appeared that wasn't there?
Yes.
All right, let's watch it move. It didn't just appear, it moves. You guys ready? Okay. There it is again. So this is the left-right pair on that one. Okay. It's the left-right pair. Both cameras captured it at the same time. Okay, so it's not there, it's not there, it's not there. Well, there it is. Where'd that come from? All right, let's continue. Now you notice where it is. I want you to see this. It's not over here, is it? And it's not right there, and it's not over here either. It's over here. Okay? So one more time. Not there, not there. There it is.
There it is.
Where is it now?
Moved on.
Right there.
Yes, right there.
It's moved. And you can see this tail better too now. All right, let's go again. That's it, the left-right pair, both cameras captured at the same time. Look at that movement. It's pretty massive. Okay, so it's not there, then it's there, and then it moved. Again. And I shared with you, this isn't the only moving creature in this image. There are at least 3. And one of the things I shared with you yesterday is that some of the creatures on Mars have active camouflage, like on Earth. And they can blend in so well with the background that you, unless you see like ears sticking up or something like that, something that didn't quite blend, you can hardly see them. There's an example of a creature like that in this series of images. And I'm going to come back to it, so I'm going to show you another creature that moved between these frames. Because right now you're probably not even seeing it. But when I point it out, it's going to be obvious. Okay? So again, this one's moved over here. This is where it is. So it was here. Well, it was not here, and then it was here, and now it's here. The tail's more obvious here. We got the crack again. That's the stereo pair. Okay, this is, well, I'm going to skip that. Hope I didn't forget a couple of images, but I might have. Okay, really hard to see this. Okay, this is this area right here. More from a distance, so you can see part of the rover there in the foreground. It's really hard to see anything here, but that's where this is, what we were looking at. Let's see if I can get back to it. Okay, well, I may be missing. Yeah, I am. I'm sorry. I'm missing a couple images of this, but what I wanted to show you, and I'll have to find that later, is this creature goes from not here to here, and then its head pops up over here. In the other images that I'm missing, sorry about that. But it moves, it's over here. You see the head pop out in the other series of images. So I'll see if I can find that, show it to you tonight. But anyway, that's evidence right there. I mean, how do you get a tail like that on a rock? And then how do you get something like this that wasn't there, pops in, moves, and then later, like I said, it's going to be over here. How does NASA miss something like that and not talk about it? Right? Okay. Let's go back to the beginning of this series. What I've got here to show you anyway. Let's see if maybe it is one of these images where it moved. Sorry, I'm going to look at this closely for a sec, in case I do have those images and I just missed it. Yeah, I did. Okay, my bad. All right. I do have the images. It's just, you know, you have to look to see this stuff. You don't look at it for a while. You get confused. Okay, so this is really where I should have started. Again, nothing in here, right? And then I went to this, which is not what I should have done. So here, the creature is right there. So look closely. It's not zoomed in here, but it's right there again. That's where it is. And then we get to this one, and it's gone. And again, now it's over here. I got those a little out of order, so sorry about that. It's over here. And the enlargement in that, though, you can make out the head a lot better over here than what you can see from where you're sitting. All right, let's go back and let me show you another example of a creature moving in this thing. And I have to look myself to see it. So this is where I should have started. You'll notice there's nothing up here you can see that looks like black ears that are sticking up in a V like this. Okay? If you look closely right here, you don't see a pair of ears sticking up like this that are black. Same thing here, it's not there. And now, I have to look, because like I said, this thing is camouflaged. Yeah, I don't think it's in this one either. Okay. It is there. Like I said, it's very hard to see. So it's this right here. So look at this area right here for a moment. It's going to become more evident. So go down. There it is again, right there. That's a creature that's camouflaged, and these are its black ears sticking up right here. And if you were to look at my screen, you'd be able to see the body of the thing more easily. I didn't enlarge that because I really wanted to focus on this more obvious one. But it's here, right here, and it's next to what I call the photobomber. And let's see if captured again. Okay, not going to be able to show you that one too well. I'll see if I have another image of it. But at any rate, there it is. And that one shifts positions when this one does. It comes into the photo, not there originally. So that's the main thing I wanted you to see here, but at least there's evidence of movement on Mars, and it's not the only example like that I have. I've got, for example, what looks like a greenish reptilian head sticking up about just above the ground, where the creature's buried, and its eyes open and close between photos. So lots of weird stuff like that. Once in a while, you get lucky and find something like this. So I'll let you see that one more time, and then we'll move on. I don't think that can be explained as an optical illusion or anything like that, or even camera angles. Personal opinion on that. I don't think it can be. And the rover has hardly moved between these photos. There is some shifting. So you'll notice the rocks are at an angle like this, and as you get here, the rover has moved more this way. But I don't believe it's a sufficient movement to move this creature to here from here, or vice versa. Or even to here when its head shows up over here in those other photos. Okay? All right, so I'm going to show you this video from Wim Whitecrow. How many of you have looked at my YouTube channel at this point? So we got about 4 or 5 people. Okay. Have you seen it, Pastor Carter?
Parts of it.
Hmm?
Yes, parts of it.
Yes, okay. I'm going to show you the half-hour interview with William Whitecrow because I wanted you to see that quote-unquote plesiosaur creature that Andrew Basiago described being on Mars that NASA photographed years later, as well as to see an example of a creature that William Whitecrow described to me in my interviews with him that he didn't know I had a photo to match. And then also that flash gun or pulse pistol that I told you about, that weapon that was laying on the surface of Mars. All of that is in this video. So I may skip through this video a little bit to move it along faster for this, but I want you to see this. So we've got internet here, and hopefully it'll just play. And actually, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to hear this, so I'll have to narrate it. Is there a way to get my audio to show up so you can hear it through this HDMI cable or no?
No.
Okay. So I'll just skip through it and
Is sound coming? Is sound coming through your laptop?
yeah, well, it's actually captured right now by this HDMI cable, so I
Yeah, there's no way.
can't do it. Okay. So this photo here has the gun, and it's also got fossils. And I'm going to show you an enlargement of the gun. Right here is a fossilized head. That's the mouth. It's cracked open. It's hard to see this because it's not large. This is another fossil. The gun is sitting right here. About the same size as a handgun that we would hold on Earth. The barrel is fatter. So I'm going to show you that as we go along here. Just skip through this. Oh. Okay. You see this strange thing above the grip right here? I asked detailed questions of William Whitecrow to describe this thing to me in my private interviews with him, so that I would know if he would describe it as as having a slightly different appearance from just a conventional gun. And one of the things that he described to me is a power pack that would plug in at the top of the grip right here. And that is missing on this gun. So maybe somebody exhausted it and discarded it. Or they got eaten. I mean, literally, that could have actually happened. I don't know. Somehow this weapon was abandoned on Mars' surface. And then it's got a lens right here rather than a regular barrel because it's actually an energy weapon. And it's got a fatter barrel. But it's got the trigger right there, the grip, the place where the power pack plugs in. I mean, I don't know how you can describe that as anything else than a handgun. You know, that in this case is a little bit weird looking because it's actually an energy weapon. It's exactly like what he and Andrew Basiago described to me in their interviews. And Andy has talked about the flash gun or pulse pistol publicly again for years before NASA ever photographed this. But that right there is technology on the surface of Mars. How did it get there? It's obviously not part of a rover. It didn't fall off of a rover somewhere, you know, descending through the atmosphere. All right. And they took a few photos of this. I'm going to skip the others just to move on here. I don't know. Is it playing? Looks like it's stuck on an image. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Let me see here. So I was talking to him during that time. Yeah. So bear in mind, by the way, I want to mention William Whitecrow, the fellow you were seeing there in the upper left. He's Native American. He's now deceased. A big burly guy who was a Vietnam War vet and then acted as a security guard basically for VIPs, people coming through the jumper through teleportation to Mars. He was a guard on Mars' surface to those folks. He was never able to tell his wife for a long time about that stuff. And then he told her about things like the gun, but she'd never seen it. So he was just really happy when I was able to show him that and then he could show his wife. He didn't know the photo existed, that NASA had taken it. All right, so I showed you this yesterday with the dinosaur looking across the Chinese dragon-like headed dinosaur. You know, it's peeking out from behind a little rock crevice. looking across at this thing, right? And I told you this was a bird-like creature, somewhat like a pterodactyl, but not a pterodactyl. But you can see here the beak, the eye area, what would be arms, but it's actually got wings, it appears hanging down. Yeah, and it's upright. It's looking across the valley at that thing. So I showed this to William because he was one of the two individuals who described dive-bombing pterodactyls, right? And this is before I had the one with the beak that was sticking out from the side of the hill that I showed you that was so great yesterday. I didn't have that one to show him at the time because I didn't realize what it was yet. So I showed him this, and I showed him another creature that was like a bird, could be a pterodactyl, leaning against the side of a hill, upright. That NASA also photographs. There are a couple in here. That was one that I showed him. I said, well, okay, there's obviously bird-like creatures on Mars. Is that your pterodactyl? And he said, well, no, it's similar, right? The next one he thought could be. So we'll get back to this. This was just adjusted color-wise, automatic adjustment, nothing manual. So I could do better than this, but again, I'm trying to avoid manual tampering with anything. So this is just enlarged and cropped. It's exactly how NASA photographed it. All right. Now here is an interesting one. NASA took 4 photos of this. This is the other one. It's actually looking right at the rover. This is the head. It's blurry, but the wing area, leaning against the side of the hill, probably a fossil, in my opinion. But you're going to see this beak right here becomes very evident in another photo. And it looks like, I thought, when I first saw this, that NASA sheared the photo off right here, sheared it to the left, or this to the right, to make it harder to recognize. It could just be an artifact in the photo, the way it was taken, that makes it look that way, or it could be that this creature actually has its head cocked like that with its neck. And I'm more of the opinion that that's really what happened in this case. So I'm going to play this so that you can just watch it as I showed it to him. Although you won't hear the audio, I'll just kind of narrate as we go. Is it playing? Yeah. Okay. Make that full size. Oh, guess it was full size. See if I have to skip forward on this at all. Try to get to Lizzie stuff. Okay, so yes, so NASA took 4 photos of this. This is what I started with William. This is unadjusted. Here it is again. Is it playing? Yeah. I'll see if I can stop it where the beak becomes more evident. Just jump through it a little bit here. Okay, right there. So in this case, I just applied a sharpening filter. That's all I did. Versus the first image you saw, it's the same image. Notice how the head becomes so much more obvious here. And you get the beak, right? The eyes and the beak. That is like a pterodactyl looking straight at the rover, almost. Leaning against the side of the hill. Like I said, it might be a fossil, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's alive. Because there were living pterodactyls that dive-bombed these folks when they were walking Mars' surface. So you've now seen 3 examples from me, 2 with wings, this one, the one you just saw, and then that great head from that pterosaur that was sticking out of the side of the hill with a wingtip exposed. 3 examples of evidence that there could be flight on Mars apart from the folded wings and that loctoid that I showed you that was insectoid yesterday, that had the amphibian mouth, the intelligent forehead, and so forth. So yes, there were flying creatures for sure on Mars. They didn't all just have appendages that, like that big dump truck-sized locust. There were creatures that had actual wings. And I have to believe they flew for that reason. Plus there's a testimony that they did. All right, let's move on. Okay. This is unadjusted. These creatures are covered in some dust from Mars, but this is how NASA photographed it. This creature right here, William Whitebread described to me in a fair amount of detail in my interview with him. There are at least 2 other creatures that are fairly obvious here. This one's pretty obvious. This is another creature between them. This one is looking at that. Maybe it's chasing it. I don't know. But you get the head, the stubby ears, the very short stubby legs on this one. This one has more like insectoid legs right here. And the eyes, the snout, a pig-like snout. William Whitecrow, when I interviewed with him, and you can listen to this on YouTube, watch it later on my YouTube channel, which is again youtube.com/Timothy Cohen, C-O-H-E-N. He described this as being an insectoid that had a pig-like snout and a ridged back that was very strange in appearance. And I thought, well, okay, I've got a creature here that definitely has a pig-like snout, and it does have a back that you could perhaps describe as a ridged back. So I showed this to William Whitecrow, and just captured his reaction to it, and he said, yeah, that's it. So let me show you what it looks like when we do an automatic color adjustment. A little more obvious, huh? Some sort of rodent, and then this weird hybrid right here between what I presume is a pig in reality and an insect of some sort. But some sort of strange hybrid creature, that's what he described to me. And it's, the shadows under it, all that. It's not just a rock sitting buried in the ground or whatever. That one, he thought was alive. I think it's probably a fossil, personally. But it may well be that it was alive. This, I think, is probably a fossil, but again, maybe not. There's a lot of dust on Mars, so even if creatures are walking around and they're alive, they're going to quickly be covered in it. All right, so let's continue. So I thought between this and the gun, that was pretty interesting, that William Whitecrow could tell me about those things, and particularly the power pack that went in the back of the gun. That's not something that Andrew Bajzago described to me, but William Whitecrow did. And they both say they were there on Mars together. So, and William was there with other people too, and so was Andy. But let's continue. And by the way, Andrew Bajzago ran for president in 2016 as an independent candidate. He was on the ballot in a number of states. It's kind of interesting. Before he had vision issues, which he's dealing with now. So again, this thing, just as NASA photographed it. You remember I told you this was in the back of a quarry? There's a stone quarry on Mars that NASA took a series of photos of with a dead humanoid body, partially under one of the stones, the slabs. And then a chair is sitting in that quarry upright, like you could sit on it right now, like one of these. But more like carved wood is kind of how it looks, ornate. And behind that stuff, literally right behind the quarry, is this. This is Andrew Bajzago's plesiosaur. This is what I initially saw. It's got a horse-like head, a serpent-like neck, and a fat tortoise-like body. And I now know, of course, these are other fossils stuck to the back of it that got fossilized with it, like that's a head right there. Attached to it, there's another head. But anyway, this thing, when I first saw that on Mars, I thought, okay, the Martians are Satanists. They're making serpent-like statues on the surface of Mars. I thought that was a statue. I did not realize that this was flash fossilization yet. So, this is the same thing put through the automatic color adjustment. Nothing manual here, no sharpening, no nothing. It's how it looks when you automatically adjust the color. And in a sense, it's like removing the dust when you do that. In some cases, you can apply what's called a dehaze filter to these photos, or do an automatic color adjustment, and then it's almost like removing the dust. So the imaging software is able to see data that we can't see with our eyes and share basically additional details with us when we do stuff like this. So again, more obvious that it's a horse-shaped kind of a head, a serpent-like neck, and this fat body. Now that's decayed. It's not a great fossil, but it's still pretty obvious what it is. And I recognize that as having a horse-like head, a serpent-like body, serpent-like neck, and a fat body, basically. And when Andrew Bajzago then described this in a radio interview, when I first heard him on the radio, and he was talking about walking Mars surface and having got there by teleportation and all the rest, I thought, okay, guy's nuts. He's nuts. And then, he hadn't yet talked about life that he encountered on Mars, but I knew about a lot of it at that point because I was, heavy into working on these books already and long past seeing my first dinosaur on Mars. And then he started to talk about encountering Tyrannosaurus Rex type dinosaurs on Mars surface, other dangerous creatures that he described. And I do have great photos, by the way, of T-Rex type heads on Mars exposed just above the surface of the ground, some of them probably alive. Because this is one thing I didn't mention yesterday. Insects on Earth, as well as reptiles, will bury themselves in the ground and just expose enough to breathe and see and hear. if they're going after prey, or if they're trying to stay warm. There's no reason to think that the dinosaurs wouldn't have done something similar. And in fact, it seems that they did on Mars. So I think a lot of them died like that because they were trying to take their last breaths when the cataclysms occurred, and they just died in place like that. Where they dug up, from having been buried and died like that. But I think others are intentionally, burying themselves and just exposing enough to be able to go after prey and not be easily seen and so forth. And then you get things like this, fully exposed on the surface. Now, like I said, that's in the back of the quarry. For all I know, they dug this thing out. Like that dinosaur that I showed you on Earth. But maybe not, because there are lots of things that didn't need to be dug out that are just sitting there exposed on Mars' surface. So this is one that Wim Weicker also described to me. He'd seen it, like Andy, on Mars' surface. But Andy is the one who went public with it, both in writing and on radio and TV programs, years before NASA photographed it. This photo is from 2012, I believe, by the way, if I remember right. 2012 or 2014, I think 2012. All right. Okay, maybe that's everything I wanted to show you in here. Yeah. So I didn't show William that much, but it was enough to say, hey, okay, here's some stuff that you described to me. All right, so let's continue. I told you yesterday that there were impossible creature sizes, and I described this to some of the folks who were with me during part of the day. One of the popular things in modern science fiction is this idea of kaiju or titans, usually depicted as gigantic reptiles, gigantic pterosaur-like birds, or other bizarre-looking creatures, but these giant monstrosities that get to be, tens to hundreds of meters in size. And then more recently, in the latest Cloverfield movie from Netflix, at the very end, as a capsule is coming down from space, because they had a disaster from some sort of interdimensional appearance of a creature on the space station and had to eject. So now they're coming back down through the capsule and just entering Earth's atmosphere and then coming down through the clouds. And as they're coming through the clouds, a gigantic reptile pops its head into the clouds. Now for that to be real in reality, the creature would have to be something like 6 miles high, maybe, total height. No longer in the hundreds of meters range, but vastly larger than that. And you look at something like that, the average person, that would include me, and you think, well, okay, they've gone a little far with the science fiction here. That's a little too nuts, right? Even people come up with this bizarre lore to try to explain how creatures like Godzilla, which is hundreds of meters high, could exist in real life. So they postulate things like powered by nuclear energy in its cells, rather than normal biochemical energy. And they make some pretty interesting arguments, in fact. And this is one reason they suggest in the lore, meaning the fiction, that these creatures consume radiation to live, right? That doesn't kill them, they consume it. Okay. We know there's more radiation on Mars. We know there's more radiation on the lunar surface because of what's happened to those planetary bodies. And really, in many planetary bodies around our solar system, there's more radiation reaching the surface than in the case of the Earth. I'm here to tell you that Cloverfield's 6 mile high, or whatever it was, reptile popping its head above the clouds was probably very small compared to some actual creatures that existed, and I'm going to show you one. Photographed from orbit. So when you're talking about a creature of that size, if you were on the Earth, let's say, and there was something even a mile in size, you'd be like a flea next to that thing. I mean, dinky, right? What about tens of miles in size? Dozens of miles in size? You can only see something like that from orbit. I mean, scales are bigger than mountains, to give you an idea. Bigger than little mountains. Okay. What you're seeing is the scaly back exposed through the ice, photographed from orbit of a creature. And I'm going to come back to that. This is the context image for the same creature. This is an infrared photo, much lower resolution. But you can see what's above the ice and what's not. And this little rectangle here is that. Okay? Same thing. Notice this that extends all the way over here, and then more right here. That's what's buried under the ice that you can't see above the ice. Meaning the creature overall is probably at least twice as long as what you can see above the ice. Well, yeah. Okay, so JPL had something interesting to say about this, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They said, let me see if I quoted it here. Oh, yeah, I did. These North Polar dunes, they call it dunes, which is really a ludicrous description, I think, look odd. Like a plant? No, I don't think so. I've never seen a plant grow scales. Or fossil, or some alien creature. JPL said that. I mean, they're biting their tongues, trying not to say anything, but they felt, you know, we gotta titillate somebody with this, right? All right, so the actual length that's exposed here is about 35 miles. So I've asked a geologist to look at this, and by the way, maybe I'll pull it up tonight to show you this, zoom in on it. You can zoom in as far as you like on this, and it doesn't get blurry for a while. In other words, this is a high-resolution photo from orbit. These scales are better defined than that notisaur that I showed you from Earth. They are not decayed at all. So you get the same kind of chainmail type structure here, with the scales getting smaller and larger, you know, going back here. You only see that in biological life. A paleontologist looked at this when I showed it initially a year ago, in October, and his mouth was agape, whatever. He couldn't, and he was also a geologist, he couldn't think of any way that that could happen in nature. I've now asked a guy who's got a master's in geology who's been involved very heavily in both creation research and as an active geologist in the field on projects as a consultant and long-term effort, but he's a very knowledgeable geologist, to look at this. I'm going to show him this photo, and I want him to tell me, can you think of any possible way that that could form in nature as something that's not biological? Okay? I'm 99.9% sure he's going to come back and say that's not possible in nature, okay, geologically. So then if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves, how is that possible? If that's a giant reptile? You know, we know that reptiles on Earth keep growing until they die, right? They don't stop growing. I suggest, and I can't explain actually how this came about, but the only thing I can think of is it had to be genetically tampered to just keep growing at a rapid rate. And maybe it absorbs nutrients through its skin. I have no idea. But what I can tell you is in the Solar Apocalypse series, the volume on Mars, I show multiple heads, skulls, that are also photographed from orbit, that range in size from like 1.5 miles to 3.5 miles. Skulls that have the area in the jaws for the teeth, the jaws are exposed, the eye sockets are exposed. They are a little bit decayed in some cases, but not very decayed. It's obvious what they are. And you would think, unless you saw something like this, those can't be skulls. You know, but then if they're artificial, you think the next option is they're artificial. Somebody constructed this, gargantuan skull that you can only see from orbit. Well, that seems like, silly. Why would anybody do that? No matter how advanced they were, what purpose would that serve? But I'm suggesting they're actually dead creatures that actually did live, and Mars had some that were unimaginably huge that put Hollywood's versions to shame. The versions that to us would normally seem ludicrous. But even JPL had to say something here. They think it looks like a creature. They're not willing to say it is a creature, but they're willing to say it looks like one. NASA's own lying people who've been covering stuff up for decades. Somebody stepped out on a limb, and they did that. They posted that on the net directly from JPL with the comment. Okay. So impossible beasts are real. Creatures heretofore the stuff of really crazy science fiction only actually did exist. Now I showed you Mars. It turns out that there were very large creatures, not that big that I know of, on our moon, on other bodies in the solar system as well. All reptiles, the really big ones. All right. What about the face on Mars? Everybody's heard of that face on Mars pretty much. It's in an area called Cydonia, and at Cydonia they have pyramidal structures, very angular, triangular kinds of structures around this supposed face that you could argue are artificial. And in fact, the Curiosity rover actually photographed the tip of a pyramid on Mars. It is an unambiguous, no questions asked, pyramid where they got just the tip of it, probably the top 3 feet of it, photographed exposed above the dirt. Perfect 3-dimensional pyramid. So the fact that they were able to photograph something like that up close, and I'll show that in the Solar Apocalypse series, indicates that yes, there could in fact be giant pyramids at Cydonia. It's not impossible. And you know ancient Egypt, Cairo, Egypt, you know what Cairo means? It's related to the god of war, but it's also related to Mars. The city is named in relation to Mars. So the ancient Egyptians made some sort of analogy between their pyramids, it seems, and what they believed to be true about Mars, which they didn't tell us. But that's kind of interesting. So the point is, the initial photos that were taken of this so-called face sitting in the middle of these angular structures on Mars, which potentially are artificial, but I want to make a point here. I'm not convinced that they have to be that, the ones that are shown from orbit, simply because there are creatures on Mars' surface, and I've shown some to Pastor Carter, that are highly angular. I gave you a few examples. I have dozens and dozens. Very, very angular, almost exoskeletal, but rather than smooth and, you know, these smooth lines and so forth that you might see on some insects, highly, highly angular. And then with eyes exposed and mouths and teeth sometimes in those same heads, usually it's heads. And I'm presuming insects, because the heads are usually separated from the bodies, but so angular that they can't happen in nature. They can only be carved, molded, or be biologically produced. Those are the only options for these examples. I mention it only because some of them have pyramidal type features, etc. So it's just possible, and I don't know that it's true, that you might get something gargantuan that has that kind of biology. Maybe not. So again, Cydonia could be artificial structures, but the face that's there is highly decayed, particularly on one side. So the initial impression, you know, at low resolution is it looks kind of like a humanoid face. And later, higher resolution photos that NASA took with different lighting on multiple orbital passes make it look like it very well could be just a decayed mountain. I'll grant them that. So I'm not personally convinced that it's actually a face. I will say, though, that it could be. It's possible that it's a flash fossilized face that happens to be badly decayed, or it's not just bones. So these other things that I told you about are actual skulls that range from 1.5 miles to 3.5 miles in size roughly on Mars' surface. This face at Cydonia is about 1 mile. It's smaller, and it's possible that it's a flash fossilized fossil that's been badly decayed for part of it. So I don't know what it is. I admit, maybe it's a face, maybe it's not. What I know it is not is artificial. One of the things that's been claimed by the people who have popularized this thing on Mars and said, hey, there's this face on Mars, they think because it's so large that it must be artificial. I'm saying, no, it isn't, and nobody in their right mind would make something that is, that looks like a face that size. And besides that, I've got bigger skulls that aren't decayed like that, exposed on the surface of Mars, plus that creature you just saw, where the back, you know, part of it, half the creature is 35 miles roughly in length. Okay? So terrifying things. Now I want to just touch, before I proceed, on what actually happened in our solar system. You know, we understand why God annihilated the hybrids here on Earth because of how dangerous they were. You know, and I asked the question last night, why would God put, say, a T-Rex in anywhere actually that it could reach human civilization, let alone in our midst. You know, we've got fossils, trace fossils with large human or humanoid footprints sitting right in the middle of dinosaur footprints. We know they were on Earth together at the same time as Christians, right? Some of those fossils are in Colorado, I believe. I haven't seen them personally, but I've seen photos. Anyway, where I'm going with that is that, in my opinion, from the things that I have seen, what was being done in our solar system is so terrifying, far more dangerous than what they put here on Earth, because like I said, they need us to reproduce. You know, Earth was just the start, I believe, of their wicked experiments with hybridization and seeing if they could make them bigger, badder, faster, and nastier, you know, than God. So they were just doing everything they could. I mean, if they thought they could do it, they experimented with it to do it on Mars, on our moon, and I'm going to come back to that, and put hybrids of every size you can imagine, from things like we see on Earth, like a little, you know, lizard, to, and actually things that are even microscopic in size, almost, animals, to something like that hard to fathom, even swallow, thing on Mars that looks like the scaly back of a creature that's better defined than what is known to be a nodosaur on Earth. So, again, I mean, we're like a speck of dust next to something like that. So, I just can't say enough about it. It's shocking to me every time I see it. Anyway, so the face on Mars is possibly a fossil, but it's not an artificial structure. But it is surrounded by possible artificial structures. And that's at Cydonia, if you want to look it up and see it on the internet. But the interesting thing there is they're pyramidal structures. And like I said, there is definitely evidence of a pyramid on Mars that's buried where the tip is exposed and NASA photographed it with a rover. So there could be a connection, in other words, between ancient Egypt, potentially, or the pre-flood world, is what I would really say, where they built a lot of pyramids. Not everyone knows that. There are pyramids all over the planet still buried under the ground, and many at the bottom of seas at this point that are pre-flood pyramids. It was a popular thing to build prior to the flood. Why that's the case? Ask me tonight in a question, somebody bring me back to that, and I'll tell you why they did that, because I know why they did that. And I know what the pyramid is really about. So, and it's not what's been claimed in many cases. All right, mistaking fossils as structures. This was my point on Cydonia. Those huge pyramids could be structures at Cydonia, pyramidal structures. But in other cases, you get these highly angular fossils on Mars that if I didn't know what I know and had seen literally tens of thousands of photos of creatures and fossils on Mars that I personally examined, if I didn't have that expanse of detail and number of examples to look at, I wouldn't realize, as I do now, that there are these highly angular creatures on Mars, lots of them. As far as I can tell, they're probably all dead and fossilized, because I haven't seen one yet that I can say for sure is alive, like that loctoid. But the point is, you see these things and sometimes you think they're artificial structures because they're so symmetrical, so angular. We haven't seen a creature with that kind of symmetry on Earth. We've seen insects, you know, they're exoskeletal, that have some angular structure, some angular symmetry, but not to that degree. So I just want to point that out. Yeah, maybe I'll show an example or two of that tonight so you can see what I'm talking about when I say angular structure that can't be produced geologically, but only biologically, and that means either as a fossil of a creature or carved or molded as an intelligent design. Okay, comets and asteroids. That is a reptile popping its head out of the side of a comet. And, whoops. That's the mouth area, the nose, an actual eye that's exposed. The ear area, well actually that's probably the ear area right there. It could be this or this for you. And that's part of the neck. Totally different coloration. You look at it from what's around it. This is another fossil right here of a creature. Another one right there, the white thing. These are all over this particular comet. And all sizes, all types, even ones looking like snakes, I love this one because it's an example of a big one and it's fairly sharply focused. Sorry. That head right there would fill 2/3 of this auditorium. It's at least 30 feet in diameter. So it's a pretty large reptile. This is one that would be, probably 100 meters in size, maybe, overall. Or am I saying that right? 30 feet, 10 meters? Yeah. No, so maybe 40 or 50 meters. But anyway, you get the idea. That's a large head popped out of the surface of a comet. And that comet is roughly 4 miles in length. Its largest dimension. So, comets and asteroids. We know that there was a war in heaven in the past because, Satan and the angels rebelled, and a third of them were cast out of heaven. We know there will be a war in the heavens because they're going to be cast down from heaven to the earth, and there's no place found for them in heaven any longer, based on Revelation. There are claims among UFO enthusiasts, ancient aliens enthusiasts, and nuts in many cases, of a past war in the heavens between the Nephilim, or these creatures they thought were humanoid gods or whatever. There are recorded records of that in history. For example, in India's historical records, they have mythological accounts of such wars and things like this. There's no record of that in Scripture. We don't know if any of what they have said is true. The time frames that they recount are not true. But what we do know is that bodies throughout our solar system were struck by comets and asteroids, including the Earth. And I believe that that's how the flood on Earth was triggered, a big part of how it was triggered. With the supercontinent being shattered, the water vapor canopy being collapsed, the windows of heaven being opened, etc., to see space, until the holes in the atmosphere, rushed back in and filled. But where I'm going with that is that the evidence indicates at least one planet or moon, a planetary body, literally blown to bits between Mars and Jupiter, and going out in a pattern, like if you can imagine, from a sphere in every direction, and striking bodies throughout the solar system. And it may have been more than one planet that was blown to bits. Now, you can imagine, what does it take to blow a planet to bits? I don't think it was an impact, not for that initial planet that was blown to bits. And Scripture tells us that God himself brought the flood, right? He did it. So if he used comets and asteroids, if he did to trigger it, that means he had to have a hand in the production of the comets and asteroids, which are populated, meaning they had to have come from a planetary body that had been seeded with hybrids like this. And there's every kind of hybrid on these comets and asteroids. In some cases, the entire creature is exposed on the surface. In other cases, it's just a head like that. Sometimes it's actual bones. Sometimes it's structures that look like eggs, that hatched, or a nest. Okay, meaning that when these things were blown into space, and let me get to that, okay? So you got a populated body that's blown to bits, right? You get comets and asteroids that way. But Mars was struck and it was gouged. And I told you yesterday that a lot of its surface, waters, and portion of its topsoil and its atmosphere were just blown right out into space. Those things that were blown together would have eventually clumped from gravity. There's kind of this distributed blob blown into space. Would have eventually clumped and formed loose-knit comets. And the creatures in those, in the midst of that stuff that were blown into space, all of a sudden, would have, as that stuff clumped, for as long as they could survive, however long that was, tried to reach some surface to breathe or something to survive. And it turns out that many of them did, like this. They reached the surface, and I don't know if this one's dead or alive. I presume it's dead. I don't have any clear evidence of extant life on comets and asteroids. Lots of frozen stuff like this. But there is evidence that there was extant life on comets and asteroids for some period of time, because some of the things that I described are visible on these bodies. But the point is, these things got there, the blobs formed, some reached the surface. You see a lot of exposed heads looking literally directly to space, like they're trying to take their last breaths, and they die, often with their mouths open. And sometimes you see fully exposed bodies. In fact, Japan just impacted the Ryugu asteroid with their Hayabusa 2 probe with an impactor that they shot into the surface at velocity so that they could eject some of the matter to see what was just under the surface. And they actually exposed, they haven't admitted it, they exposed the complete body, one side of it, of a dead creature when they did, in the pit. So I'm going to show that photo in the series. Now that's comets and asteroids. I'm not showing a lot of photos from that today because I'm not ready to. But I have realistically thousands. And this is a pretty good one because it's sharply focused. But can you guys sort of see how this is shaped like a head? You can see the nose area, the mouth. You can actually see where the mouth has lips, by the way, if you look closely here. It's got lips. And then a very good eye area. But the interesting thing about all of these examples, even though they're not terrestrial in the sense that we would be particularly familiar with them, is we can always see the biological components we would expect of a head, like on Earth, in the right places. So not randomly distributed in some odd place. You know, you can't say that that's pareidolia, because it's very obvious. The symmetry looks just like a head, and the color is completely different from what surrounds it. And that is not edited at all. It's enlarged, nothing else. This thing right here is another head. Harder to see, but there's the eye area right there. Okay, I can enlarge that, and then you'd be able to see the detail of it. All right, the moon. Today we look at our moon, and it's a gray ball of dust, you know, with darker areas like the Sea of Tranquility and stuff like that, right? One thing that's not generally known by the public, but was quoted actually recently with the 50th anniversary of the Apollo program, is that the astronauts, when they would get back into their capsules and remove their helmets, or back into LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, that's what LEM stands for, when they would get back into it, after walking the surface of Mars, their suits would be covered in dust. It's very fine, powdery dust. From the regolith here, this dust. And they reported that it smelled like burnt ash. That's what it actually smelled like in the capsule. Which is an interesting thing, because I've noted to you last night that you can't walk anywhere on the surface of the moon without running into fossils, including heads and skulls. And sometimes there's more than that exposed on the moon, and I'm going to be showing that in the series. Sometimes you find tracks going in multiple directions out of craters, what they think are craters. Okay? So there are multiple things that are happening on the lunar surface that are confusing, that people have not properly understood. They look at the moon, they see all those craters like we do from Earth, and they think every one of those things is an impact. That's not the case. Many are impacts, many are not. And some people have pointed out that these things are too shallow to have been formed by impacts in some cases. They're too shallow. It's more like you got this rim and then, say, mud or whatever, you know, that filled it up to some extent, and then it froze hard. That's shallow. It's more like that. But you get other things that I will just share with you here. I'm not going to show you evidence of that tonight. Are nests for large reptiles. And they actually use it kind of like a trap, I'm presuming, but perhaps to help protect themselves against the elements of space a little more and the radiation. I don't really know for sure. But they're effectively nests, and they come up from the center of these things, large, giant heads sometimes that are exposed. But they range in all sizes on the moon. So before I get into showing you an actual skull on the moon, I'm going to show you one in this photo right here. Okay? There's one that the astronauts walked right up to in this photo. Which is, and actually there are several in this photo. I'm going to show you one that's particularly well defined. A number of these are flash fossilized in this photo. I'm going to show you what's more like a regular skull. At any rate, in the last couple of years, some astrophysicists and others have come out saying, you know, we think there's evidence that the moon once had a thick atmosphere and an ocean. And we think that was there for maybe 100,000 plus years, and therefore the moon could have sustained life. This is what they said. They're evolutionists, their time frames are completely off. They think that was there for a very brief period in the billions of years history of our moon. Say for 100,000 plus years, 200,000 years, whatever, in that time frame. And that the moon could have sustained life because it had an atmosphere and an ocean. Hardly anybody's heard that. But I knew that the moon had that years before they ever talked about it because of these fossils all over the surface of the moon, which include sea creatures. Reptiles, insects, sea-type creatures, etc., fossilized there on the surface of the moon. And I told you there are different kinds of fossilization for the moon and for comets and asteroids. Comets and asteroids would have had the same flash fossilization that we see on Earth because they were ejected with water and bacteria and the chemicals necessary that was in the water already into space. So they could still flash fossilize even in space, but they would have frozen very rapidly too. And if you're talking about a creature like you and me, with flesh like this, rather than something that's exoskeletal, if we froze in space, eventually we would desiccate, but we'd become rock hard, contorted and rock hard. An insect, on the other hand, if it was exposed, say, to the vacuum of space and direct solar radiation and constant heating and cooling, could eventually desiccate and turn to powder, but preserve the exterior appearance till it's touched and collapses. I'm not going to show you an example of that latter kind of what I call fossilization. Fossils, basically, in this case, that would be a trace fossil. But this is what I call flash freeze-dried fossilization. I made that up. Okay? I call it freeze-dried fossilization. Anyway, kind of like freeze-drying your food for too long. Subjecting it to some radiation. Okay. So I'm going to show you a fossil. Let me show you where it is. So that fossil is, I think, let me see here. Yeah. Right here. I'm going to show you an enlargement of that. This is a skull, right there. Right where they set up their equipment. I've actually got another photo, there's a series of photos from this particular Apollo mission, where the astronaut walked right up to it and stopped right there. Literally at the base of the thing. So I've got photos of the astronaut here, 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 and this fossil right there. That's an enlargement. Exact same thing. So here it is again, right there. Here's the enlargement. You can see the shadow. Notice the shadow is narrow. Like you would expect from a reptilian head that's slender. Okay? So there's no depth, in other words, behind this thing, and it's not actually going into the side of the regolith right here. It's fully exposed in 3D on the surface. Teeth, jaw, eye socket, maybe ear socket, part of the nose exposed in 3D with a shadow. They walked right up to that. One of the astronauts did. That's a completely obvious skull of a reptile. And they come in all shapes and sizes on the moon, including orbitally photographed snake-like serpents where you see the head and sometimes even part of the snake-like body in a crater. You get really freaky stuff. But the point is, every Apollo astronaut encountered stuff like this. Most of the rock samples that they brought back from the moon have little heads in them. Heads of different sizes. A number of the rock samples actually are heads like that. Maybe not quite so cool as that one because it's got obvious teeth. But, you know, they were just grabbing this stuff everywhere and they call them rocks. Because what are fossils on Earth? They're rocks. They've been mineralized, right? Every fossil you've ever seen in a museum is a rock. But not every rock is a fossil. So don't let somebody throw you off by saying it's just a rock. Right? It's obvious it isn't just a rock. And so you get the Apollo astronauts, every one of them walked up to stuff like this and walked in the midst of stuff like this. All kinds of fossils, including flash fossilized fossils. And they never talked about it. ever to the public. And the most scientific individual to go to the moon in the Apollo missions was astronaut Harrison Schmitt, a Harvard geologist with a PhD. Apollo 17, final lunar mission that NASA has publicly acknowledged. Harrison Schmitt was examining large fossilized heads, and they got video of it, not just photographs. I had the chance to confront him. He didn't probably realize that that's what I was doing. But to confront him this year at Apollo-palooza at Wings Over the Rockies in Colorado, near where I live. Because he was showing lunar photos and so forth. He's this geologist. And he talked in the past, in an interview, of the need to send paleontologists to Mars. And he was one of the ones who discovered the reddish soil on Mars, the very red, rusty dust. It looks exactly like the soil of Mars. And they weren't sure what it was at the time, if it had cyanobacteria in it, or if it was actual rust, or what it was. They now know it was glass beads and rust, little tiny glass beads. But he was examining this with Apollo 17, and so that was a fairly major discovery on the moon for a variety of reasons that I document in the Solar Apocalypse series. At any rate, I knew this guy had examined fossils and got video and photos of him doing it. And he's a Harvard-trained geologist, not a paleontologist. And so I thought, I wonder, since he suggested maybe they need to send paleontologists to Mars, that he knows that he saw fossils on the moon. You know, a lot of these Apollo astronauts, when they came back, they sounded so convincing. You know, you would think they didn't see any of that stuff on the moon. And unless you zoom in, I mean, if you're looking at this photo, which, by the way, is just a crop of a larger photo, do you see any obvious fossils right there? Probably not, and especially if you know nothing about flash fossilization. This is a series of heads right here, grouped together and fossilized. You can't really see it in this photo, but they got it from a lot of other angles, multiple photos of this. But you look at that and you say, okay, that's just a rock. And you look at this thing here in the background, and you can zoom in on this, by the way, in the high-resolution photos. That is a head with an eye socket popped up through the soil that's flash fossilized. A bigger head than this skull right here. And they're all over the place, as a matter of fact. But you would look at this, and if you don't zoom in, you've got no idea that there's anything other than rocks and dirt right there at all. You also don't realize that this is actually burnt ash. The gray regolith, it's ash. You don't realize that. You think it's just regular, you know, beach-like dirt, maybe. So, that being said, when these guys came back, they were initially subjected to quote-unquote quarantine. And they had a counselor assigned to them who hypnotized them. Where they tried, and the claim was that it was to help them remember what they saw on the moon. I would suggest it was the opposite of that, to help them forget what they saw on the moon. And again, they didn't all experience this. They stopped the quarantine after they realized there wasn't any dangerous bacterium coming back with the astronauts that can infect Earth. So, what I'm saying is, I asked Harrison Schmitt, this is not Apollo 17, by the way, this is an earlier mission. I asked him, and by the way, this is recorded, you can see it on YouTube. His Apollo-palooza presentation, you can see me asking him the question and hear it, and hear his response. I asked him, did you encounter anything that you thought could be a fossil on the surface of the moon? He blatantly lied to me, and I asked him also as part of the question, why did you suggest, I prefixed it with this, why did you suggest that we needed to go to Mars with paleontologists? And then I said, did you see fossils on the moon? Trying to see, were you making a connection like that and trying to clue the public in is what I wanted to know. And he basically indicated to me, no, and then he gave some macroevolutionary explanation that was really kind of nonsensical in my view, to suggest how he was rationalizing what he saw on the moon, and then from that, his suggestion that we needed to look for fossils on Mars with a paleontologist. I know he lied to me, and I show that in the book, because I show him examining fossils. But I asked him the question, and I quoted him on that. All the astronauts either lied or they forgot. I don't know which it is. They tell it with such a straight face. But then you've got NASA this whole time since bacterial life was found in the 1970s with the Viking missions on the surface of Mars, lying to the public about having found that. And I was sharing yesterday with Pastor Carter and a few others as we were driving that. A man named Gilbert Levin, he's a 95-year-old PhD scientist who is an inventor and who was part of developing the experiments. In fact, he was the main person for developing the labeled release experiment to detect whether there was microbial life on Mars for NASA. So he worked for NASA for a number of years. And NASA had put 3 experiments aboard these Viking landers to detect microbial life, all different in nature in terms of how they would approach trying to do that detection. And they agreed that if any of them were positive, that would be proof of at least bacteria, ongoing bacterial life, respiration if you want to call it that, on Mars. 2 of the 3 came back as absolutely positive. 1 came back negative. One of the 3 that came back positive was the labeled release experiment. That's what it's called. It's the one that Gilbert Levin primarily was in charge of and designed. That was strong positive. The 3rd one, the one that came back negative, they later tested it on Earth because it was determined it was defective and it couldn't detect bacterial life here. In far more favorable conditions, obviously, right? There's bacteria everywhere on Earth. It couldn't detect any of it. So NASA, on the basis of that one flawed experiment, which they know to be flawed, has said to the world, well, okay, what we found on Mars with Viking landers was inconclusive. And so this whole time they've been saying to the world, you know, we need all this funding, we need to do more missions, we need to look for life on Mars. So how do they start? Well, we're going to look for organic chemicals. You know, none of the rovers have any life detection equipment aboard them right now, just photographic equipment and some chemical equipment to try to detect things like organics, like the latest rover, the nuclear-powered Curiosity rover, can detect organics in the surface, and they have detected organic chemicals in the surface of Mars, but nothing to detect biology, nothing like the labeled release experiment. You know, they're not admitting that all these photos are obvious biology, like the ones that I showed you. So they continue to maintain this line, and the last few NASA administrators have said to the public, each of them, well, we think that we're going to find, you know, proof of life within maybe the next 10 to 20 years, I'm paraphrasing. Bolton, I forget his first name, Charles Bolton, I think, came out and said he thinks it'll be in the next 10 to 15 years, roughly. Captured on video doing this. But before he answered the question, he said there was life on Mars, and then he quickly, you know, after having that little stumble in his mouth, tripping over his words, corrected himself and said, well, we think we'll find life on Mars in the next 10 to 15 years, roughly. And then he focused in on bacterial life. And this is constantly, all they will talk about is bacterial life. Even though they've intentionally destroyed fossils, marine fossils, like a marine fossil on the lunar surface that they photographed that looked just like, I forget what they call it right now. I want to say cardioid. I got the word cardioid because the microphone's in my head. So looking for mics recently to find this thing. At any rate, it's not a cardioid, but it's a marine fossil, and I'm forgetting the name of it right now. So NASA photographed this thing, and some of their people on staff and others were saying, hey, you need to test this thing to see if it could be an example of life that matches a creature on Earth, a fossil. And instead of doing that, NASA crushed the thing to test it chemically. A clear fossil, they destroyed it to test it chemically and wouldn't admit that it was a fossil, and now, of course, the evidence is gone. So this is the kind of thing NASA's been doing, and presumably to maintain budgets, funding, but also to keep the world in the dark about what's really there. And there are a variety of agendas for why they might do that. So, you know, why would they want to do that? They talk about non-contamination of Mars, because again, these are evolutionists, right? They think that if we go to Mars and we find some evidence of life there, we could contaminate the planet. So if everybody suddenly realized there was life there, the public might say, you better not go, right? Or even dangerous life, you better not go, unless you're heavily armed. Others would say, well, you know, we can't allow humanity to contaminate Mars, not realizing that what's there actually came from here. And the danger of contamination is the other way around, because that stuff's been hybridized. It doesn't belong in existence. Other than maybe that iguana that, I'm assuming it's hybridized, but there was obviously an iguana on Mars. So anyway, So it might have to do with biological contamination. It might have to do with the reality that it's dangerous and they really want to go regardless, right? Because who knows what they can find on Mars, such as high technology. And I will tell you now, I give examples of not just megalithic structures and clear molded things that are artificial on Mars, very clear photos of those things, in fact, but also of high technology that's littering Mars' surface, like that gun, only it's not a gun. So components of technology. NASA has photographed stuff like that, and they're not talking about that publicly either. So there's a real possibility of actually retrieving technology on Mars that the Nephilim could have left behind. That's an actual possibility, and I think that the space programs know that. The secret space programs certainly know that, the ones who've actually been there. So they want access to that stuff, both above ground and underground. Obviously, I can't show you anything underground, but I know there's stuff above ground, and there are claims of things underground. So that being said, they could have a variety of reasons, but then there's this other thing. If we tell the public that there's life on Mars and it resembles life on Earth, that could totally undermine monotheism, right? And Pastor Carter was asking me at the end of the day yesterday, or the end of my presentation, a question. I said, I'm glad you asked that. I really need to address that. I wanted to address that, and I had spaced it yesterday, which is, why does it matter to us as Christians and to the church, any of this? Why should we care? You know, apart from the fact that Elon Musk might send people and there'll be lunch for dinos, because they're not armed and they don't know what to expect, and they might not actually get to establish the colony they want to put there. So, other than something like that, why do we care? Multiple reasons. You know, I shared, and I think I shared last night, didn't I, that part of the effort, the satanic agenda, is to delude mankind into making war against Christ and his angels at his return, as if that were some sort of alien invasion against which we needed to defend. And I shared with Pastor Carter and some others that this has happened before. In other words, war in the heavens, where a planet was blown to bits. Presumably God did it, at least one planet, and destroyed, through bombardment, a lot of what these Nephilim were doing in the solar system. You know, our moon, the atmosphere was completely ripped away, and the moon doesn't have much gravity. So, once you get enough of an impact, boom, it's just gone into space. And then what was left of the water on the moon would have quickly frozen, and then it got covered in ash. So you got this searing fire that would have enveloped a good portion of the moon, producing all this ash. At the same time that the water's been blown into space, or excuse me, the atmosphere has, and the water that remains that isn't blown into space, and probably a good portion of it was, but whatever wasn't blown into space froze, and they got covered by this falling ash. And so now, just under this ash, in many cases, you find ice on the moon, and there's a lot more water there than they realized. And it wasn't that long ago, a couple decades maybe, that they were saying, well, there's not any water on the moon, it's just a dry rock on our moon. And now they know there's tons of ice. Lots and lots of ice on the moon. Do you know that the lunar surface, 40% of it roughly is oxygen by weight? These creatures, whatever's on the moon, anything that's still alive, has access to water and oxygen. And all the same chemicals that you find here on the Earth. The chemical composition of the moon is very similar to Earth. And on Earth, there are reptiles, including sea snakes, that can absorb some percentage of oxygen directly through their skin. Now, if these creatures have been hybridized, maybe they can do something like that. The moon was much more hospitable to them when they were put there before the destruction that happened. That being said, I have evidence, and I put it out in the Solar Apocalypse series, that there's ongoing life on the moon. A lot of it, particularly in the craters, and that in many cases these are dinosaur-like reptiles. I have photos of what looks like a dinosaur walking the surface of the moon, fully exposed. Other examples of tracks going in multiple directions out of supposed craters. Some are craters, many are craters, but many, I think, are dens, the equivalent of dens that a creature on Earth might make to help protect itself. In the bottom of many of these craters, however, and photographed from orbit, lunar orbit, are these glowing things, these bioluminescent creatures. They bioluminesce. And on Earth, bioluminescence normally means current, ongoing life. On Earth, when a creature bioluminesces, it's active biologically. We only know of a couple of things on Earth, where that's not the case. There are some jellyfish that when they die will continue to bioluminesce. Many don't, even among jellyfish. And there are some birds that have beaks that actually bioluminesce that you and I can't see because it's in a wavelength that we don't see, but the birds themselves can see it. And they continue to bioluminesce after they're dead. But this is bioluminescence that's visible to us. And the fact that it's happening in deep craters all over the moon, and that these bioluminescing objects are shaped as creatures, and sometimes even attacking one another, you know, like having a meal kind of thing, suggests to me that this represents life on the moon. These aren't just glowing rocks, and not just dead fossils, because they are bioluminescent. They could be just dead fossils, you know, if they're like those jellyfish that bioluminesce after they're dead. I'm guessing that's not the case, though, because of tracks going in multiple directions out of craters on the moon, things that seem to traverse between craters that have been captured in photos sometimes, and other things like that. So, they've lied to us ever since the beginning of the very first Apollo mission about what's really on the moon. They haven't told the world the truth, and all you have to do is look at the photos to see that. Now there are massive numbers of high-resolution orbital photos that you can zoom in very close, like very close, and get good resolution and see what's actually there in terms of fossils and creatures. And again, fossils everywhere. So, our solar system is not what has been claimed by macroevolutionists. And for these things to be there, and even for ongoing life to be there on Mars, if it was a catastrophe that happened even 1 million years ago, let alone tens of millions of years ago, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years ago, with the damage that Mars sustained, that life should have died out by now. Should have died out long ago. If the catastrophe was just thousands of years ago, as Scripture would indicate, in other words, it happened as a preamble, if you will, to the flood on Earth, it's easy to understand how some of those things could have survived till now. So, yeah, I'll stop with that. There's actually a lot more in the books for the Solar Apocalypse series, where I address a variety of things. So the whole secret space program thing I address, the claims that are being made I address. I address the other Mars claimants, the people who say they were on Mars, so the ones who are frauds, in addition to the ones who seem potentially legitimate, who were able to tell me things they shouldn't know about unless they really were there. And I also address in great detail, and I had thought in the past actually about writing one or more books on this, science fiction and Hollywood movies and the delusions, you know, that are being put out. They contradict Scripture, you know, the subtle lies and so forth. I had always thought, you know, always, for at least 25 years roughly, about writing something like that, but I never undertook it because, well, I've got too many other important things to do, you know, in terms of the books that I'm working on. You'll hear about some of that tonight. However, when I got into this, I decided, okay, I know so much about what's being put forward in science fiction because of these things that I've watched over the years that I set about to watch thousands of programs and movies as part of doing this series and rewatching a lot of things. And I captured the quotes, the dialogue, the scripts, portions of them from all of these things that relate to life on Mars, life on the moon, life on comets and asteroids, a cataclysm in our solar system. Everything I've shared with you, everything, just about, except maybe the fossils on the lunar surface to some extent. All the rest of it, in some fashion, is alluded to or directly spoken about in science fiction television shows and movies since the 40s, 50s, on up. They knew things in the 50s about Mars, about ongoing dangerous life on Mars. They shouldn't have known. Unless humanoids, for example, interacting with governments were sharing things, and then it was being leaked to Hollywood to be put out as what are called soft disclosures. In other words, it's some truth with a lot of fiction and lies thrown in and false backstories and so forth, put out as entertainment. But so like in the 1950s, there was a movie where they sent a crewed rocket to Mars. They get off on the surface, and then suddenly these creatures are coming up from just beneath the soil and eating people, the carnivorous and the reptiles. So, very interesting. And then Anglia Television in the 1970s did a program called Alternative 3. It was just an episode of their science program series. And in Alternative 3, which is based on a book, they did a mock set of interviews of people who were actors representing supposed real individuals involved in the secret space program. And these are mock interviews about life on Mars, about what they found there, about Mars having been nuked by Russia, you know? And later you got this fellow, John Brandenburg, who came out talking about Cydonia, saying Mars was nuked in the past. That's how the dinosaurs, or not the dinosaurs, but how Mars was destroyed, and Cydonia was destroyed, and so forth, and there's radiation there. He's wrong about Mars being nuked. His explanations are wrong, and I covered that in the book. It was in the book on Mars, the volume on Mars. It happened through bombardment from comets and asteroids. But that being said, Alternative 3 did this very interesting program talking about life on Mars and supposed actual encounters. They acted the whole thing out like it was real events and suddenly a disclosure through a news program. And then within the midst of that, they put an actual clip of a mission to Mars, and they claimed it was a real clip. Okay? Of a mission to Mars that was a joint US, Soviet, or Russian mission. Had to be in an anti-gravity craft. Anyway, they went, they filmed it, and as they're approaching the planet, there are these creatures moving just beneath the soil. You see the soil being disturbed. And you also see some heads pop up, and in one case there's a blinking eye of a reptile that's exposed. You have to watch the clip very closely in the quality that they released it in to see that. We didn't have the CGI technology when that program came out to fake that. But even if they had faked it, well, let me backtrack for a second. One of the interesting things about that mission is it's got dialogue in English and Russian, and there's subtitles. And in the subtitles, they're reporting the pressure on the surface of Mars. And the pressure is not what NASA claims. It's more like Earth, the atmospheric pressure. And I was sharing with Pastor Carter and some others in the vehicle last night because they were asking me, well, how do they breathe on Mars? You know, isn't it supposed to be much colder and much thinner atmosphere and much less oxygen? And I was sharing that there's reason to believe that NASA's also been lying about what Mars' real atmosphere is like. Scientific reasons to believe that. And that there's evidence, in fact, provable evidence, that they've tampered with the data after releasing it to the public about the temperatures and pressures at Mars' surface being measured by the rovers. So there's a lot of reason to think NASA has completely lied about the real atmosphere on Mars. The atmosphere, the pressure that is being calculated and reported by a father-son team, one being a PhD physicist, aligns with what was in that clip from that Alternative 3 program on Anglia television, perfectly. So in other words, it perfectly matches what that clip claimed in terms of the pressure. So they're approaching in this craft, and they're filming it as they approach Mars' surface, and they get really close. And then as that's happening, and they're reporting the pressure and so forth, and everybody in mission control is happy because you can hear them in the background being ecstatic that they made it. They are seeing these things that they're filming moving beneath the soil, and one of them is a reptile's head with an eye, that blinks. So we didn't have the CGI technology to fake the blinking eye at that time, even if we could have faked the rest. But because of the claims of the program about Mars, which I knew to be true, I'm suspicious that the clip is a real clip and it represents an actual secret mission. It was leaked to the press, and around that they built the rest of this story to try to release what are called soft disclosures, only a little bit more blatantly, and without actually saying, you know, it's a real program, rather than, yeah, we made this up, yeah, we made that up, we acted this out, we acted that out. Yeah, and oh, by the way, we stuck a real clip here in the center just to confuse you. So the point is, the solar system as it is lines up with Scripture very well. The cataclysm that was brought to Earth wasn't merely to save life here, but to preserve it, I believe, to prevent the possibility that one day these monstrosities that had been put on Mars and our moon and so forth might reach Earth. That could be really terrible if they were capable of reproduction if any of these things reached Earth alive. So God was acting to undo what the Nephilim did here on Earth, but also in our solar system by and large. But it was spoiled, you know, like we got the tares among the wheat on Earth, and we know that at the Lord's return, the tares are going to be removed. Okay? What was the purpose of the rest of the solar system? And if the moon was habitable, Mars was habitable, Venus was habitable, you know, before these things happened. Did God intend that one day we should expand initially out into our solar system and populate those other planetary bodies? They were highly habitable compared to what they are now. And I'm going to submit that that was originally his intention. And by the way, we find these same kinds of things in science fiction, you know, like 2010, Space Odyssey. What happens at the end? The aliens give us new planets to populate near Earth in our own solar system and a second sun. Right? All near Earth. So, and there have been multiple sci-fi shows where things like that have been thrown in at the end, you know, as almost like a satanic mockery in my view, because it's God who creates a new heaven, meaning solar system, at the end of the millennial kingdom. He makes new heavens, plural, and a new earth, right? What is that about? So this is right after the great white throne judgment, when all the non-believers of history have their final judgment and are cast down to their final punishment, including the angels. So there, you know, we have a brief period at the end of the millennial reign where there are angels who go out to cause trouble on earth again and to seek to destroy Israel and God's people again, you know, and deceive the world, kind of like at the beginning, so at the end. And fire comes down out of heaven and consumes them, and right after that, the earth vanishes in a sense, and you get this great white throne judgment before God, and all the dead of history are raised for a final judgment out of the books. And, you know, and only those who are in the book of life enter the next phase, which is the eternal state, where he's made a new earth, and the curse has been removed, no longer in decay, right? So the curse is finally gone. But new heavens. So in other words, all these damaged bodies that are basically uninhabitable in our solar system now are going to be replaced, I think, my opinion, we'll have to see what God does, with habitable worlds. So while God stopped what they were doing, by and large, in our solar system, the worlds that are there now have been spoiled. You know, we're going to continue to advance through the millennial kingdom, I believe, and become very technologically advanced by the end of it. But even with that, it's going to be a real challenge if we want to expand beyond Earth and begin to populate the worlds that are in our solar system right now because of the damage. And it's certainly not, you know, if you could live there, you know, in a habitat like on the moon, or even to a large extent on Mars, it's going to be a very barren and unpleasant existence, right? And it would take a long time even to terraform Mars, and that is possible, by the way. And I'll just mention that here at the end. But wouldn't it be so much better if our solar system was filled with habitable worlds like Earth, only not in a fallen state? And I think that that's what God's going to do. So he's going to completely undo the damage that has been wrought over these millennia by the devil and his emissaries. And so it's going to be wonderful, but we'll have our eternal bodies. And this is a conversation for another time, but I do believe we can have children in God's kingdom. I do not believe that what the Lord meant when he said we're like the angels also means that we can't have children. I think that is not what he was talking about at all. And so ask me a question about that tonight. I'll give you a detailed answer and you'll understand where I'm coming from on that. But it means that even in our eternal bodies, the solar system and then the galaxy, or other solar systems in the galaxy and then the universe, they're all here for us in time, I think, to expand into and to explore. And, you know, perhaps God will create other life at some point elsewhere. I mean, it's a big place, right? It's almost infinite in size. We can't even measure it accurately yet, because each time we think we're getting there to the boundary, there's more that we suddenly say, because our telescopes have become better and bigger and more advanced. So we never quite get there. We never really know how big the universe is so far. And, but we know at this point there are trillions of stars, probably, trillions. And exponentially more planets. And a number of those planets are going to be in what's called the habitable zone, meaning the proper temperature range for life like what's on Earth, potentially. And a large number of those planets have water and oceans. It's pretty much known at this point. So there are a lot of habitable worlds already in our universe. But God will start with a new solar system here for us, I believe, at the end of his 1,000-year reign. And was there something else I was going to come back to? Did I space anything? Well, I'll stop there. Do we have time for questions, Pastor Carter, or do we need to wrap it up here?